And Wallace, thank you very much indeed for coming on Rwanda.
Pleasure.
Yeah. You are a journalist, primarily.
Yep.
You know, we often hear that most journalists are frustrated writers.
Yes.
You have a few books under your belt.
Yeah.
So presumably you're a relaxed man, no frustration, at least on that score.
Well, I think I'm a writer who's a frustrated journalist most of the time.
It's becoming like that for you, isn't it?
Yeah, sometimes, you know you have a piece and you want to write it, but it's either time or, increasingly today, especially writing on Rwanda, it's finding an editor who is willing to publish. And I think in the French world it's a bit different. They have sort of friendly editors. In the UK we don't have friendly editors on the papers anymore, whereas they used to take pieces by myself or Linda Melbourne or whoever frequently. Now it's a real tough job if you don't toe their editorial line.
We're going to come. We're going to come on to that a little bit later. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let's have a look at your journey to the interest in Rwanda as a journalist, of course. When does it start? I know that we can talk specifically about some of your books. One of your first books looked a great deal on what was happening in 1992 when with the French really buttressing the Habyarimana's genocidal army, and we can talk about that a little bit later as well. But before, was your interest before that? What was the interest in Rwanda?
Well, I think I've always had an interest in Africa, which is, let's face it, pretty unusual in the UK these days, where you mention the word Africa and it's like you've poured a bucket of cold water over the conversation. Really, it's one place. Well, let's be fair, actually, since Brexit, or even before Brexit, the UK population has become more and more insular. A bit like the sort of, a
little bit like the Americans.
As you took the words out of my mouth. Yeah, it's this sort of, we're fine on our own. We don't really need the rest of the world. How we ever got an empire, I don't know, because this sort of expansionist global policy we had 200 years ago has long since gone, and getting people to think outside their town is quite impressive at the minute. So I think from early doors as a young child I was always interested in the rest of the world. It's always more interesting to me than tedious old UK stuff. Listening to the BBC this morning, moaning on about the National Health Service, which is a favourite topic when they have nothing else. Or our social security.
It's a major institution. It's a major
and of course,
institution in the UK, so one understands that.
And it's enormous. This huge thing. But we've sort of got stuck in this sort of very insular way. And I suppose from an early point of my life, I wanted to look outside. I saw things happening in South America. And India. I was lucky to spend a year in India when I was 18, and we travelled a lot when I was young. So I always had a sort of interest in what was going on outside, and tailored to being a sort of a historian. I'm far happier in the past than the present. When I sort of started, when I first came here in the early 90s, it triggered a sort of, what an interesting country, what an interesting people.
Let's moor it on the first story that you thought, I'd like to do a story on this. Can you remember roughly?
In terms of
Rwanda.
Rwanda. The figure who first captured my imagination was Agathe Habyarimana. I read only the odd sentence here and the odd sentence there in a book by Prunier, in a book by Alison Deforge, and some French authors, and they're always talking about this woman. There was not much detail about her, but it was clear she was a very important person in the history of Rwanda, and it was clear she was at the heart of something, but I didn't know quite what the heart was.
And this was about when, in terms of...
sort of 2 or 3 years after the genocide against the Tutsis. So, and that, as I looked into her, then I began to sort of make connections with France and some of the international actors.
Okay, so let's not get too far on that one, because that one needs to, a book comes out of that, of course, which is your latest book. But prior to that, let's look at, you mentioned France. You did your first book on Rwanda, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong on here, was on France's involvement. Tell us about that.
Well, I mean,
and you can mention it so that those who haven't read it.
Okay, well, it's called Silent Accomplice,
yes.
The Untold Story of the Role of France in the Rwandan genocide. Notice a couple of things, or two or three things with the title.
Untold story.
Title's always interesting.
Yes.
One, Silent Accomplice. That was not, that was my publishers came up with that. And actually, it was a very good title, and increasingly good title. Because
what was yours?
I didn't have one at all. But the more I think about it, the whole point now, the argument is, was France an accomplice or not? That's the debate, and has been the debate ever since. This sort of, you could say, sleeping partner. You know, the French government liked to say, well, they weren't an accomplice, they were, you know, they got too close to a regime, they didn't understand the regime, they sort of slept walk into this sort of genocidal
and what did you make of
regime.
that? You obviously did a great deal of research on that. What did you make
Yeah,
of
well, I thought
what their stance is now?
Well, let's just finish off on the title. Yes,
right.
as you said, The Untold Story. Why is it untold? Well, of course, you can say if you live in Rwanda, well, everyone knows.
Yeah.
If you walk around here and you talk about France, everyone knows about the French involvement.
It's more an unacknowledged or unlistened to story than an untold one. As far as Rwanda is concerned, they've told it enough times.
Yeah, I've certainly told it, and it's been told goodness knows how many times in the French world. But in the British world, it was, I mean, my publisher didn't know anything about this, and certainly when the story broke in 2006, when the book came out, it was untold. People were saying, what? Seriously, France was involved? I mean, not just involved, but complicit. You know, and it caused a little bit of a storm of protest. And it came out just at that
From
time.
home, France mostly? Or?
Yeah, France. I mean, I wrote a piece in the Times when the book came out, basically exploding the myth about what France did here in this complicity. And there was a letter back in the Times the next day from the French ambassador accusing me of defaming France. He didn't answer any of the points I'd made, of course, but there we are, I was defaming France. The day after that, Sir Edward Clay, who was the British ambassador at the time, actually in Uganda, not here, wrote a letter to say the French ambassador protests too much. I was there, I know what went on, I know the role of France. So all of this was sort of going on, but so it was untold. And the final bit, of course, the third title is
The Silent
Accomplice, the Untold Story of the Role of France in the Rwandan Genocide, full stop. There's no mention against the Tutsi, because in 2006 this revisionist denial mantra had not reached such a point that we had to actually specify, as we do now, it was against the Tutsi.
In a way, really, the statement, the acknowledgement of the fact has taken stages to arrive to the truth, which is, first of all, you start off with a complete attempt to deny that there ever was a genocide, and then accept that there is a genocide, and then third stage, it is a genocide against, it's got to be against somebody.
Against
it
the
can't
Tutsi.
just be, yeah.
But you know, but it seems to
and
me...
some still haven't arrived, and we
remarkable.
can come to that
Yeah,
later.
I mean, you have the Armenian genocide, the genocide against the Armenians in 1915. You have the Holocaust. You don't say the Holocaust against the Jews, the Shoah against the Jews. It is, there were other groups who were also targeted, you know, gypsies and homosexuals and politicians, etc. But
and you don't say, you know, genocide against the gypsies, against the homosexuals, against the disabled, against, you know, and so on and so on.
I mean, it's part of it, but you know, it's a sad state of affairs in the world today that you have to specify the group, because this genocide denial lobby has reached such proportions. And of course, there's certain countries, myself, my own, and certainly America, who still sort of refuse to use that.
Yes, which is very
specification.
It's very interesting because they to date they have not defined precisely what is a rather absurd position, which is we will not say against whom the genocide was. Well, there either was or there wasn't, and if there was, it was against somebody.
Absolutely.
So that position is still a bit bizarre.
Absolutely, you can't. Well, it's a sort of BBC position, which is sort of balance. Somehow they want to balance the genocide.
It's about balancing what?
Well, exactly. You balance the genocide. So, but you cannot balance genocide. I mean, you have, a group is targeted.
And is it the
by another
BBC position? Because I think it's a political
I'm sure it
decision.
is.
First that, and then it becomes a BBC position.
I mean, this balance, which is just ludicrous, really, this fairness and balance the BBC moans on about constantly.
Well, the principle is absolutely fine.
The principle policy, but of course, if it's fairly carried out throughout. So look at the Ukraine war and Russia. The BBC coverage is certainly not balanced. They've got reporters all over the place in Ukraine. It's a constant drumming.
Anyway, let's not make this about the BBC. So
no. We can always come back to them. That's one of my hobby horses at the minute.
All right,
I will get down off that particular hobby horse and let you carry on.
All right. So so you've got the silent accomplice.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the silence.
Yeah.
Because quite frankly, from the conclusion that certainly I could say, getting off the fence here, that I've reached, including by reading your book, is they want that silent about it. There's nothing silent about it. In fact, it's hugely loud.
It depends where the silence is. Obviously, at the time, the French had a very bizarre. And of course, when I say French, it's much more nuanced than that. It's not all of France. What's quite clear is the recent Duclair and Mousse reports have shown. There's sections of the French government were jumping up and down and saying this policy of ours, supporting these genocidal regimes, is highly dangerous. We should not be doing it. We need to remove ourselves as soon as possible. And yet there are others in the senior military figures and around the Elysee of President Mitterrand himself, of course, who were just refusing to budge on this.
Let's say the French establishment will not accept the complicity, much as they know it to be true. And but there are some who look at this and wonder whether something needs to be rethought. But France, in general, has not arrived at the reality that they were complicit in this. So this argument it's somewhat, it's spurious in a lot of ways.
It is a little bit spurious, and of course it's all involved in politics. And having said that, it's also involved in money and compensation as well. And that's why. Sorry is always the hardest word, because it might have a big
but the legality of it also, that's the legality of it, because Rwanda has never really, at least to date, anyway, they may at a later stage, but they've never required or demanded or asked of anybody
absolutely, but there's always that fear.
They simply want the acceptance of the truth.
There's always a fear with this sort of compensation culture we have today, that if there's any even suspicion that someone has wronged you in any sort of way, and certainly committing a genocide against you would count as a wrong.
No, but I think that there are ways of, as we know, governments of phrasing the acknowledgement without opening themselves to any legal implications.
Well, possibly, but I think that there's a whole number of reasons, and I think not least because of the actors involved. Many of the senior actors involved at the time, people like Herbert Védrine, are still very much there. They're still very much active players.
There's a case in France at the moment, isn't there?
Absolutely, and nobody, it's not good on your CV to say this. One of my tick boxes in my past was
in a way,
I helped
really
organise a genocide.
Yeah. So in a way, really, they are yet to come to terms with their let's be charitable and say involvement in the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi. So that is the nature of their involvement, whether it's silent or not. I put the question, let me put it again. From, if one were to ask you the conclusion of your research and so on, was it silent? And then we can talk about why it's unfolded.
Well, I'm a big fan of the word nuance, because I think, you say it was this or it was that, it was black, it was white. Certainly, if you look at Operation Noroît between 1990 and 93, France bent over backwards.
Explain that, so for anybody who doesn't know.
Okay, yeah, sorry, a little bit of a history lesson as we go along here, but when the RPA invaded in 1990...
The RPA is the Rwanda Patriotic Army, which is the forces that stopped the genocide. The military, the military arm of the RPF, Rwanda Patriotic Front.
I mean, you can say RPA, RPF.
Right, yeah.
Came in October 1990, came in from Uganda, sort of volcano area in the north. France immediately reacted. Habyarimana was quickly on the phone. He was in the States, he came back, he was on the phone straight away to Mitterrand saying, help. Basically, the armed forces, the Rwandan armed forces, were in a mess. They'd had 15 years of Laurent Serubuga and this guy, Jean Rwagaflita, head of the gendarmerie, highly corrupt, highly useless, and really the armed forces, there were only about 3,000 soldiers in this so-called army, disastrously ineffective against anything. So he knew he needed propping up. He was hoping Belgium would prop him up, and he hoping France. Belgium took one look, and within a week had sort of sent troops in, and a few weeks later took them out again, saying we're not going to prop you up.
Up the hill and then down the hill again.
Absolutely, we'll get rid of any of our own citizens who want out, but otherwise you're on your own, Habyarimana. Mitterrand took the opposite line, and so for the next 3 years, every time the RPA launch an attack or make progress, more members of this Operation Noroît, North Wind as it's called, come in and basically protect Habyarimana and help train the army, help fund the army, give the army millions of francs worth.
I mean, the numbers are extraordinary, isn't it? I don't know if you recall any of them offhand, but from the few thousand that you say, it became a huge army.
Oh, within a year, it expanded tenfold. It was up to 30,000. But of course, those 30,000 were very ill-trained recruits. Occasionally, they mutiny because they're fed up. They're no real match for the RPF on the ground.
Except that they are much better armed, much better resourced, almost endlessly by the French.
Yeah, I think the big difference is air power.
Yeah,
the French are making sure that there's these Gazelle helicopters, attack helicopters, which could do a lot of damage to RPA columns. And these heavy, they start to give 105 millimeter mortars, which are very heavy mortars and can make a lot of difference on the battlefield.
And there's of course no particular surprise because yes, Habyarimana, again, for somebody who didn't know, the president of Rwanda at the time of the genocidal establishment, there was no surprise because prior to the RPF coming in militarily, they had made a number of efforts for years trying to come in peacefully. So he would have known that they're going to come in one way or the other. And,
well, certainly, I mean,
so when he refused the peaceful overtures, there was only one other
Well,
option.
I think they had intelligence reports that the RPF were planning this. It wasn't, as you say, it wasn't a big shock to anyone, except they were taken by surprise, which is a complete failure because the intelligence reports were there saying, this might well happen. Even Museveni had warned Habyarimana this was on the cards. So on every level, it had been forewarned, the invasion.
So either do this peacefully or this is going to happen.
Well, effectively. And Habyarimana always hit back against this, saying, well, the country's full.
That's right.
We've got 8 million.
Famously when he demonstrated the with a glass of water, saying if you put more water in it, it'll just overflow. And that really was, in a way, the faithful demonstration.
Well, it just showed he wasn't going to budge. But I mean, you think Rwanda then had about 8 million inhabitants. Today we're probably around 12.
13 almost.
Almost 13. So there you go. You know, up at least a third more than when it was full.
All right. So the French come in pretty much full force. There is nothing that they will not do to support. We know, for instance, that even although they about training and supervision, we know that at certain instances, certain battles, the IPF engaged the French. Manning the roadblocks when people were selecting whom they were going to kill. They were very much part of the genocidal establishment. So I'm going back to this idea that he was in any way silent, or is in any way because they were part of it.
I suppose what I should come back and say is silent from whom? It was silent from the international community. At least, you know, the people on the ground here knew. The other the embassy officials from around the world, the Belgian ambassador knew. The Americans obviously knew. But from public opinion in France, this Operation Noroît was very much downplayed as just, we're just protecting our nationals in Kigali, we're not doing anything more. So it was silent from that, from outward general opinion.
So that takes us to the journalism, essentially. You've had this most, even for people who don't care, just looking at it objectively, let's say you really couldn't care less. But looking at it objectively, it is a human catastrophe. It is one of the most earth-shattering things to happen in the 20th century. So journalistically, you're going to look at it from that point of view, even if you don't care, even if you don't have any human feeling about it. It's still incredibly, really, it's magnetic. You have to go and have a look at it. So then comes the question, why isn't it properly covered? Why isn't it all the information is there? The RPF, for a group of people who are, you know, very, very sparsely resourced, and who are engaged in war for their lives, really, and for the lives of their country and their people. They were also very much aware of explaining themselves, of saying who they were. So no one can say that they couldn't find the information. So why do we not have clarity on this? Why do we not have coverage where people do the job? You know, 5 Ws. What on earth is going on here? Who are these people? Why do we not have this?
So are you talking about now or at
the
time?
Then, at the time, then, yes.
Well, I think there's a whole load of reasons. Let's not just talk about one reason. I mean, and
let's
you
have
can
about
speculate,
3.
But okay. The first thing is what was happening around the world when the genocide here was taking place, because, as you know, with news, what is news today is very quickly overtaken by news tomorrow, and news hounds always like to be breaking news stories, and especially
that, you know,
what is interesting to people. So the British public, while it's huge for African, certainly regional actors here, you know, in Britain, in our Brexit Britain, as it was at the time and still is, our splendid isolation, it takes a huge story worldwide, a tsunami, to actually affect us. And speaking of which, the tsunami a few years back only affected us because a lot of Brits were on holiday there and were caught up in it. One suspects if the tsunami had happened in Central African Republic, where there are no Brits, it wouldn't have been much news at all. So that was important to say, you know, when the plane went down at the beginning of April, what was the big story worldwide?
I understand it. So
worldwide,
this argument, absolutely. This point is made often with some
Well,
it's some just
I say it's one. It's not the only, but it's
Sure.
certainly one reason.
the point is made quite often with some justification. So yes, there are a number of major stories happening in Africa, and let's agree that they
around the world.
all right, but let's stay within Africa at the moment. In Africa, there is the ANC triumphs over the apartheid system. Nelson Mandela is out of prison, and let's be a bit blunt about it. The Western world is interested because there are people of European descent in Southern Africa.
Exactly.
So there's a major interest down there. And then, of course, in the former Yugoslavia, there is a genocide also taking place over there. So understand all of that. So let's say up to it's the and so on, these things take up their attention. But then the other side of the coin to that, as you rightly mentioned, you do the news, and then it's the next thing. Once you've done all of that, they're not so on. But then the next thing is Rwanda, and anyone is worth salt. Surely must look and say, what on earth is going on in this place? Again, there's France is involved. The Belgians, to some extent, are involved. So there is interest within the Western interest, the Western sphere, and the UN Security Council is involved, but most journalists can be forgiven for not knowing that interest until, of course, they have a look. So again, there are reasons why you'd look at this. I'm trying to suggest that the idea that things were going on around the world isn't much of an excuse.
None of it's excuses. I mean,
isn't much of a good reason, I would say.
Well,
never mind excuse.
I think you have to understand, and you do because you know the UK well, how UK media or American media works. So at the beginning of April 1994, the big story, which was covered in all the press there, was the suicide of Kurt Cobain, the grunge Nirvana lead singer, the most charismatic pop singer, the sort of Paul McCartney of the times, a rather different style of music. He was found dead with a gunshot wound in his garage. There was all sorts of speculation why had he done it.
You see, look, sorry to interrupt. I understand all of that. I understand all of that. But you see, I'm trying to get at something specific here, because what you described is absolutely right in the way that the news works, and a pop star will take up a lot of coverage. I understand all of that, but in normal circumstances, look, we're talking about some very good journalists here, and who most of them at the time even much better resourced than they are now. So yes, all of that is true, but they will find time for these big stories, and I'm just trying to understand why they did not find the time for this
because one. At the end of the day, journalism, as you well know and I know, it's a sort of, in some ways, it's a marketing exercise. You're giving people what you think they want. There's no point giving them stories which they're just going to look at the headline and turn over. They're not interested in that. They've got to have some sort of interest in it, which is why we get vast loads of rubbish about our royal family and who's wearing
it isn't
which.
rubbish. Domestic stories are important.
Absolutely, no. But I'm saying from my point of view,
from a Republican point of view, that's absolutely fine.
No, I'm not a Republican either. But thank you for labeling me.
Domestic stories are absolutely fine. But let's look at it.
No, but I think this is the point I'm trying to make. Is it's a business model. Journalism is a business model. You give the people what you think they want to read.
Yes, all of that. Again, all of that is true.
If you fill Katie today with stories that people aren't interested in, very soon Katie today
all of that is
relevant.
true. All of that is true. But it does not stop them covering the major journalistic stories.
If you look at a big broadsheet paper in the UK, the Times, the Telegraph, as it was then, the Independent, which was actually very good. It's only online now. They tend to have world news. So you'd page through page 1, page 2, page 3, home stuff, and then you get page 4 and 5, if you're lucky 2 pages, world news. And
well, let me try it this way. On that world news,
yes, you've got to have, what the world leaders are doing, blah, blah, blah. And then you'll probably have a column or 2, if you're lucky, on Africa. Actually, these days, you could go a week without anything on Africa.
All right. Well, look, when we're listening, even as I make it,
yes,
is that you looking at a media industry. Okay, I'm looking at the journalism, and I know that there is the journalism within this media industry.
Well, I just think I take a little bit more of a realistic view, perhaps, in the sense that I know newspapers because I know how it is to get published with them. When you've got a story, that's fine, great, you send in the article, as you say, here's a brilliant story. They will have a look at it. Now, it has to go through certain guidelines to ever see the light of day, usually.
Of course. Or the process, I understand. The point I'm trying to make here is that in spite of all of that, within that perspective, there is the journalism which says this is a particularly important story. So irrespective of Kurt Cobain or irrespective of this, what's happening in the
Mandela, O.J. Simpson, all the other.
Let's do this story.
Yeah.
So there is that journalism, but that journalism did not happen for Rwanda. Well, that is what I'm trying to get at.
Well, I would come back on that because actually, if you go back,
I take you out of the picture because it did happen for you. So let's not.
So
don't take it personally.
Certainly, no. I never take anything personally. Otherwise, I would certainly not be sitting here. I'll be sitting in a dark room somewhere, crying. But okay, so I think certainly in France, and again, we've got to make another nuance difference here between the francophone and the anglophone papers, because I think in France it was pretty well covered. They had some excellent, almost all of their papers had articles. Not if not daily, but every 2 or 3 days. They had all sorts. They were putting pressure on their government. They wanted answers. They had the NGOs there also pressing, and they had very good advocacy networks with the press. So that was working well.
Well, you know about this. You will know about this.
Hang on, I'll just finish that point. But in the Anglophone world, you see, there isn't that intrinsic interest. This is Francophone Africa, not Anglophone. Rwanda is not a country anyone in the UK had heard of in 1994. There's no reason we should have done. Kenya,
but yes, you see
Uganda,
what I might say. Well, again, we arrived at this where I acknowledge that will be a point. But you see, the British public doesn't know about East Timor either.
No.
But they will go and cover East Timor.
No, they wouldn't.
So, they did cover East Timor. Well, I covered East Timor.
But not in a... it's
all right. But tell you what, let's go back to...
Let me just finish my point on the Anglophone press, because I think it's slight disservice, because I think, post 94, I would put... Given up on Rwanda and stories from the genocide against the Tutsi. But in 94, the Guardian with Chris McGreal.
Chris McGreal did a lot of very good work.
In the Independent, Robert Bloch did an awful lot of very good coverage. And you go in the newspaper archives now, and they followed it all the way through. They were in the camps interviewing, even the BBC. Doyle.
Now you're actually coming round to my point, which is the point you're coming round to my point. Am I? Yes, and the point I was making is that the journalism is there, irrespective of the nature of the media. And I'm just saying that you've mentioned those honourable exceptions. So what I'm just saying is, why was it just those honourable exceptions?
Because I don't think they could find the room in the papers for this story.
Let's say, I want to get to the conclusion. That's what I want to put this to you. It's not because they could not find the room in the papers. It's because they would not find the room in the papers.
Of course, that's what I mean. I mean, it's euphemistically. And you can also say, is there an element of racism in this? And of course, you could probably say, rightly, yes, there is. Effectively, you know, to
in a
me,
way,
I'm not just sort of talking, you know, in its insular world that the British seem to inhabit, especially the press. You know, if you just look at boots on the ground, you know, there was a day in the 1920s, 1930s when almost every country in Africa had its own correspondent, newspaper correspondent. Every country would have one. Now, for example, the BBC has got one poor guy who's covering his firefighting. He goes from one election in South Africa to an election in Nigeria to a civil
on that
war.
One can understand. One can say budgets. That's understandable.
Absolutely, but in '94,
which is entirely different.
You know,
which is entirely different.
It's a practical
from
reason.
the journalistic interest. It's a practical thing.
It is a practical thing, but you have to take that into account as well. So
what I'm taking into account. The point I'm trying to make is
this.
The point I'm trying to make is this. There are the realities of the media as it is. Okay, but in spite of that. Important stories are covered.
Yes.
Except when it came to Rwanda. That was my point, you know. And somehow they chose not to do that, with a few exceptions that you mentioned. Yeah, well, I could sort of go along with most of that. I mean, and you're driving me against the wall. And all right. Let me be kinder. Let me go back to an area that you will know a great deal more about than I do, because of course you did the research for your book, which is the coverage in France. If they did cover it so extensively and so well, you know, why do we still have this confusion in France? Why do we still have all of these suspected alleged mass murderers, and some of them actually clearly convicted mass murderers wandering around? That's clearly not to do with the press. That's a whole different issue of justice and politics. Well, I'm connecting it, since we're talking about the journalism, I'm connecting it with the journalism because it comes about awareness, clarity, general clarity within the nation, within the country. So if say radio programs, television programs and newspapers are covering it properly, sufficiently, I rather suspect they're not. That's where I'm getting at, really. Because if they did, the story would be a little bit different. The nuance, as you prefer, would be a little bit different. Would be, look, we were, even if they don't choose to use the word complicity, we were deeply involved in this. So why are we not doing X, Y, Z? To be fair, that's what would be in the media, in the journalism. There has been a lot of that in the French press. I mean, you know, I'm the first to put hands up and say this is where they have failed, this is where there are gaps. But I think over the years, on the whole, and there has been some one or two really disastrously sort of negationist articles that have appeared, or cartoons which are frankly racist in the French press. You know, papers, Libération, Maria Malagardis, who by the way was here in '94, you know, has remained impervious really in the last 23 years in getting out huge output. I mean, in the last week, for example, we've had several articles on Agathe Habyarimana. We're going to come to the present day at the moment. Yeah. But at the moment, you seem to be also, again, you have the advantage over me because I don't know the French media industry that well. You know, slightly, fairly informed about it, but not a great deal. And what I see isn't particularly impressive, but where you're taking me is, again, honourable exceptions. Broadly speaking, they're not doing what they ought to have been doing. Well, you know, I think you're sort of demanding a little bit too much. I'm asking for journalism, actually. Well, no, you are demanding for journalism. I'm asking for journalism, which exists. There are good journalists there. Of course. So I'm asking, why are you not doing it? Of course. I'm not asking too much at all. Well, my feeling is, if from a European point of view, when you are your average man, I mean, we are not average in the sense that we are very much involved in Rwanda and its story. Well, you know, for the average Frenchman or British, you know, housewife sitting there opening their copy of the paper in the morning, which, by the way, most don't do anymore because it's all read online or on Facebook or whatever. Although there are a few. There are a few physical newspapers about, but an awful lot. Analog still rules. Yeah, it's sort. Sunday papers still exist. Yeah. Sort of, but it's, you know, as you know, it's becoming, you know, more and more people get their news from Instagram and YouTube and other places anyway.
But when they wake up in the morning, you know, what do they want to read? Do they want to read about a Central African country which has gone through a genocide? And I should add, they're not even quite sure what the word genocide means. And why do I say that? Because, you know, when I talk to my friends, I just have to mention the G word, and already they're sort of screaming and shouting and saying, "Oh, shut up!" You know.
Well, I'm being somewhat rudely dismissive on this, because we're going back to this idea of the nature of media and then the nature of news coverage. I understand what you're saying. They don't want to look at that on the Sundays.
Yeah.
They don't. They want to look
Absolutely.
at the NHS. They want to look at the royal family. They want to look at Kurt Cobain and so on. Nonetheless, let me make this point again.
You're making the argument of what they should be reading.
No, not at all. Not
a matter of should.
Not at all. I think you're excusing something here.
I'm not making any excuses. This is not an excuse. This is, to me, is the reality.
All right, I will tell you what the reality is. Actually, I will.
Your reality and mine.
I will
different,
count. No, not at all. It's not mine or yours. Your reality. We're talking about the reality of the news coverage, of the media coverage, and the reality is this. You know, yes, the media industry will look at what is sensational, what is going to bring in, you know, eyeballs, what, you know, and its broadcast, what is going to put, you know, quote unquote bums on seats and so on. Yes, they will do that, you know. But I made this point earlier. In spite of all of that, in other stories, there is the journalism. In spite of all of that.
Give me some other stories. Give me another story where you would say it's better.
And you mentioned, and you yourself mentioned, with the honourable exceptions that bring out this journalism, they make my point. So I take the same thing to France. It's exactly the same thing. You know, there is the journalism, but there is almost a decision, you know, editorially, not to do that journalism.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'd go along with that. I think that's
wonderful.
exactly my point.
I
think that is my point.
Our realities converge.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, look. Let us come to now. Okay. So we are, of course, now in the commemoration of Kwibuka 30th, which is the 30th anniversary of the 94 genocide against the Tutsi. At this stage, then. In normal circumstances, again, bearing in mind what we've said, you'd be getting clear analysis. Nobody would be asking, well, what is genocide? What is it? You know, we should not be arguing about, you know, why aren't you calling it genocide against Tutsi? Because, you know, it is genocide against Tutsi. So when you have, you know, major institutions like the BBC, for instance, you know, refusing to do this, what is going on? You know, and let's start from the baseline, the basis that whatever you think of them, the BBC is extraordinarily good broadcasting institution. It's one of the best in the world. They've got very good journalism. You know. So this is a choice. What is going on?
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating book in itself, which someone somewhere should write. It's not going to be me, I hasten to add. But it's very interesting how over these 30 years, since 1994, the BBC, and indeed other broadcasters, but let's talk about the BBC, how its editorial stance on the president, Kagame, and on the nation and on the government here has changed. So for many years it was very Rwanda centric. It was very enthusiastic about the new government. It was and surprising.
Was it ever?
Yes, I think it was. Or should we say
in the 90s? I was working within the BBC at 90s. In the 90s.
Yeah, well,
it didn't seem to me to be so.
Say more sympathetic. I mean, it acknowledged that here was a country a bit like a lot of other African countries, i.e. in a mess, you know. And it's odd in those years, those post-genocide, immediate post-genocide years, so 95 up to sort of 2000, 2005, Whereas the president himself said in his speech on at the press conference, you know, he didn't smile then because there was not much to smile about. And it wasn't. Rwanda in the 10 years afterwards was in a huge mess. And in every area of society there were gaps. You know, in funding, in infrastructure, in people, in skills, and the list goes on, which you expect because, you know, really 1994 in July, when the new government came in, Rwanda, the whole of Rwanda, not just one little area, was ground zero.
We can come to that, but I want to get back to, let's look at now.
Yeah.
Let's look at the coverage now. And as I say, we are having somewhat 30 years later, there should be clarity on what happened, on and also what is happening now in Rwanda. There isn't. There is almost, it does seem to me there's almost an attempt to divert and pervert what the truth is. So what is going on with this coverage?
I think the coverage has been a victim of current politics and political views changing, and that has affected editorial views and papers changing. And so the sympathy which was there for the first 10 years after the genocide has slowly seeped away. Why has it seeped away is
now
a very
hang on, before you go
question.
to why is it seeped away, no one is asking for sympathy. No one is asking.
No, but
when simply asking, I'm asking a very simple question.
Yeah, go on.
I'm looking at the journalism, you know. You want to, the basis of what we do is we inform people. And there is, it seems to me, I'm putting to you the fact that it seems to me that there is almost, I mean, I don't want to make any blunt accusations, but it seems to me there is almost a deliberate attempt at diverting what the truth is. So I'm looking for the journalism here. Why is that not happening? Why do we need to spend so long arguing about that it is a genocide against Tutsi? It is a genocide against Tutsi. So why are we arguing about this? And why would we having Rwanda is a very open country. The ministers, the officials are incredibly accessible. If you want to know what's going on, you will know what's going on. Nobody's looking for sympathy. Nobody's looking for pro or against. One is looking for a balanced coverage. Why are we not getting that?
Well, you are putting to me a sort of, if I may say so, a slightly utopian
not at all.
Rwandan view. No,
not
no,
at all.
let me finish. Because as...
But see, you're suggesting that to get the journalism is utopian.
Well, no, I am a little bit, because I think in the end of the day, all, just like we could talk about justice and I can talk about that in a similar sort of line to the journalism in a way, because I think it is all affected by politics. And it is the political line that, unfortunately, journalists end up having to follow. They may not know they're following.
You know what? Everything is affected by the political realities. But the Western media has got sufficient arm's length capability of doing their work.
Ideally, in an ideal world, yes.
It's not in an ideal world.
It is.
That is the reality as it is. They have got the freedom to be able to work unencumbered politically. And it is an editorial decision often to say, let's do the truth or not. So that's what I want to limit myself. I don't want to go too much into the politics, because that's almost excusing it. Because I'm just looking purely at the journalism.
Again, I think it's the reality. I know from my experience. Let's give you. Let's pull it down to experience here. So let me just talk about my experience. I know for the first 10 years or so, 15 years even, if I wrote a piece on Rwanda and I sent it in, an editor would give it a quick look over and would publish it. There would be not a problem about it at all. You know, when my book came out, I could write what I wanted about France, bang, go in the middle of the Times, okay, or the Guardian, or whatever it was, wherever it went. Now, you know, in the last 5, probably 10 years even, that has changed totally.
So you're talking about the commissioning of pieces right now.
No, not commissioning of pieces. If, you know, I remember I did a piece on, for the Times on Paul Rusesabagina when he got his prize, the Landos Prize. You know, this great human rights body in the States gave him this prize for being, you know, this Prince of Peace. This was 10 years plus ago. Now, I had a few problems with that. I have a lot of problems with Paul Rusesabagina in the sense of who he really was, who he really is.
Well, we haven't got time to
go into that. But the point was, I did a piece about that. I talked to some of the survivors from the hotel. I talked to, you know, a lot of people around him. And I sent the piece in, and they said, fine, we'll publish that. And out it came the next day. And yes, it had my byline on it. It had my Andrew Wallace as the headline, etc.
But it's been grossly edited.
Absolutely, it's been edited with an inch of its life.
That's the point I was about to make to you.
Everything had been turned on its head. So I then had to ring up my sources and say, "Look, I'm really sorry."
Look, that was the point I was trying to make to you, which is it isn't how many pieces they do, because I can accept the reality of the media in that Quad Carbon will take the space. I understand all of that, but even what they do is perverting the truth. That's what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
So why?
Absolutely. Well, why did that editor choose to completely destroy my story?
There. Yeah.
Well, we can leave it a question, but you know, we can speculate, we can argue here, but clearly, you know, there is an editorial line at the BBC, at The Guardian at the minute especially, which has run a lot of stories on Rwanda.
Of course, they would say otherwise. I mean, let's mention that.
No, I don't think they would. I think they would say there is an editorial line and you cannot cross that line. This idea of sort of free speech, it's no longer. I can write the best written, most well-sourced piece and send it into The Guardian, and if it doesn't toe the line they want, they either will reject it or they'll take it and just change it.
Okay, well, look, we mustn't end.
It's frustrating.
We mustn't end this discussion without talking about your second book, which is On You Tell Us.
Yeah, it's about, well, really, it's about the perpetrators. To me, and it's a line I come out with a lot. So for those watching this who have heard it before, I apologise. But to me, you know, if you don't have perpetrators, you don't have a crime. And into this space in the last 10 years, this void where you've sort of got a crime, but, you know, people say, well, you show us who's done it. You know, that in the media, there's no mention of Bagasora or Zengiyumva. There's no mention of Zerera or Kabuga.
All right.
And so it's very easy to say, well, if there's no one there who did anything, well, clearly nothing was done.
So all of these characters are covered in your book, which is called...
So the second book, which is called Stepped in Blood, Akazu and the Architects of the Genocide Against the Tutsi.
Akazu, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, let's explain Akazu to somebody who doesn't know. It's really, I suppose, a clique, a cabal.
Yeah, very basic. It's a sort of mafia group which ran the Rwandan state.
A mafia-like group.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. Why is it important? You say, well, a lot of governments have this, you know, a powerful sort of group around the government. What's important about it? Well, the family, which came in when Habyarimana had his coup in 1973, took control, I would say, of every single part of Rwandan society. It's difficult to believe today, but you know, you've got this, the church, the businesses, the administration, education, you know, university. Well, there's only one in those days, the National University. Yeah, every single point. If you wanted to open an egg shop somewhere in town, you would need
within this cabal
somewhere, and it sort of started at the centre with Agathe and her three brothers, and then it spiralled out. So, you know, your Catholic and Protestant archbishops were members of it. The senior military groups, senior military figures were part of it. The prefets, obviously, and the burgmeisters, and it's the cell leaders, all the way down to society. So you have, in a way, two governments. You have the official government, which foreign dignitaries come and shake hands with, and then you have this sort of mafia parallel government.
The power behind
which really moves. Why is it important in 1994? And it's important because these people had a heck of a lot to lose. And really, the genocide to me, obviously it's a political crime. The ethnicity is an excuse, but it's a political crime. They needed to stay in power. Agathe wanted to stay in power. She had power, she had wealth, she had effectively
Again, for those
the
who
case.
don't know, you're talking about Habyarimana's
now living in a
in France.
house in a very nice French suburb, Paris suburb.
Which is, I mean, I don't want to go back to where we are, which is also extraordinary in the sense that the journalistically, normally, one would look at that, and there ought to be a clear, it's journalistic interest in the fact that you've got this woman.
Surprisingly, I mean, if you do a search for, in the last week, 10 days, it's funny, having had radio silence about her really for a good 10, 15 years, suddenly this 30th Kwibuka, there's been a lot of interest in her all over again. And I think that's all to the good, because I don't think she'll ever stand trial now, sadly. I think she's getting too old, and I think a good defence lawyer will, like Kwibuka, say she's not fit to stand trial.
So let's, for people who want to see that story, your book, as you say, is called Steeped in Blood, and it is, you can mention the publishers, I'm sure they would like that.
Zero Books.
Right, and it can be found...
It can be found at Ikirezi or down at Gisozi at the Memorial.
So it's available everywhere.
Yeah.
Let's also gallop fairly quickly, in the interest of time, through a website that you've set up. Tell us about that and why you've done that.
Okay. It's called Rwanda Justice for Genocide.org.uk. You'd say it's a gap in the market. But what is interesting, again, we go back to Francophone and Anglophone. Francophone, there's a lot of blogs. There's a lot of commentators, journalists who, if they can't get their work in a newspaper, can't get out what they want, they have blogs. They have abilities to talk about Rwanda and the genocide against the Tutsi. It's interesting, in the Anglophone world, there's nothing like that. There's no resources really at all online. You have to sort of do a Google search, and then you come up with maybe an individual trial or an individual case. So what I wanted to do is collect all these stories, especially about justice, focusing on the 5 genocide suspects who have been in the UK for more than 20 years. The UK government won't extradite them, and it seems very reluctant. The investigations into them have been going on for years, and the UK has got a frankly disastrous history. It's never had a single trial for genocide in 80 years, not just 20 years, 80 years. It's only ever had one successful war crimes trial in 80 years, and yet we've had, over that time, I should think, tens of thousands war criminals and genocidaires making home in the UK. And these guys are clever guys. Though you don't have to be too clever. They
planned a genocide.
You planned a genocide. You're looking for a new home.
You look around the world. You're not going to go to a country that is.
You're going to find one that is sympathetic.
Absolutely. Well, and sympathetic, but it's apathetic. The fact is, the British just don't care. If their country is full of war criminals.
Well, again, they would say otherwise.
Boris Johnson in 2022 came out to Parliament. He had a question. I think Andrew Mitchell asked him a question on this, and he said, "No, we are one of the best countries in the world. We will certainly never allow, in very Churchillian voice, we will never allow war criminals to make their home in the UK." Well, I'm sorry, Boris, but in 80 years, you've done nothing.
All right. So the website is to demonstrate what is going on.
Well, sort of that. I mean, it's a campaigning website because it's trying to put pressure on to get these.
It's a campaigning website,
absolutely.
Right.
But secondly, it's a resource website, so you can go on today and you can see where the case against Fulgence Kayishima in South Africa is at the minute. The last of the big players, who was captured last year. Yeah. You can see the trial of Kwibuka, where it got to, and read what transcripts there are. You can look at what happened in the French trials.
It's almost taking from the kind of research you do when you're about to write that.
Absolutely. But I want people to be able to read trial reports and see what actually went on. I want them to see which countries are acting and which aren't. There's a very good timeline to show exactly that, which countries are acting, which countries are not. And sadly it's the UK and Italy who are doing nothing. But some countries are extraditing. Some countries are putting them on trial in their own jurisdictions. We have universal jurisdiction, means you can now try a person who's committed a crime in a foreign country. But some
few are using it,
very reluctant. They're very expensive, these trials to put on. They're very resource intensive. And so governments on the whole, do the same as their journalists. They just avoid getting involved in countries outside where matters they don't think. Does the UK taxpayer want to pay £5 million to put a Rwandan on trial for a crime committed in Rwanda?
But actually the UK taxpayer has paid a lot of money to keep these people in the UK.
Absolutely.
And they are on legal aid using very expensive barristers. So it would actually in a way be cheaper to try them and get it over with.
Well, you can say that, but then you've got to put...
Well, 20 years, them going into appeals after appeals, and then they're
it's
financed, so it would be cheaper.
Well, even cheaper would be to have effective scans at when they come into the country. So when they come in using a different name, there are checks, proper checks done. And if they are suspected war criminals or genocide suspects, then action is taken against them right at the start, not halfway down the line. I mean, what is interesting is all these 5, as in France, in Belgium, action is being taken against them by civil groups or the media. So it's the media who exposed these 5. They weren't picked up by the British police or immigration. It was the media putting pressure on the politicians to say, look, we've discovered this guy was probably heavily involved in the Rwandan genocide against Tutsi. What are you going to do? And shaming the government to actually get the authorities to arrest them. Then, of course, the authorities just drop them and hope the story will go away.
Will die away. Let's end on saying something nice about the media. So you've just done that for them. They essentially exposed these things and brought them to light. We could go on and on, and probably we should another time. And Wallace, thank you very much indeed.
It's been a pleasure, Vincent. Thanks so much.
Thank you.